Hey, we should be live. Let me
Hey everybody.
let me just check. It's always good to check. Oh, great! I love it when like YouTube. Oh, don't go
Hey.
full screen. We should be live.
Hey everybody.
We are live, Jake. It's working. Oh, wait a
Yay.
second. I chose normal latency, so it's a bit of lag today, everyone. Sorry. Well, that's if anyone's
Well,
watching it. It already says two. Well, no, two people just became one.
well, one is not me. So, I mean, if you wanted to kill it and make it low latency, that's fine.
Nah, it's so good. It's less important for this one, I reckon.
Yeah, sure.
Uh, we don't need that hyper quick. Oh no, but where?
You are
Look over
wrong.
there. Yeah. Oh man, it's another day in quarantine or
It is
isolation.
indeed.
It's funny in the US they've called it shelter in place, which sounds much cooler than
Shelter in
practicing.
place.
Sounds so much cooler than practicing social distancing. And like the name social distancing. Just like, isn't that what you do to the weird kid in school?
Yeah.
Not the ew. Maybe actually that's kind of apt. Maybe everyone's like yucky and got boogers now, so we don't want to go anywhere near them. Oh man, jeez, far out. Weird times.
It
Been
is weird times indeed.
watching lots of. I don't actually. So we're just off the back of a long weekend. So this week, if you've looked at the comment for this video, like zero viewers at the moment, so it doesn't matter. But if you've looked at the comment, the description for this video, we've come off the back of a long weekend, and I mean, we could have spent some time preparing, but we had fun.
We had some fun instead,
So
yeah.
this week is a more casual kind of just gonna cruise security stack exchange. There's some interesting questions that we can kind of go, here's what we know, or that's interesting, or I'm not 100% sure. We'll see how that goes. Again, there's always plenty to learn and plenty to realize. Like, every time you think, I know everything, and then you read a question and you're like, I don't know
Actually, I
everything.
probably couldn't answer that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll do a bit of that, but just, our normal kind of pre-stream, just have a bit of a chat while we wait for 8. Man, I just cannot be bothered to like go and post a link and all my usual link posting places.
That's totally fine.
Yeah, I'll make doing there. Okie dokes. Well, let's see. Like, what's some news? Again, my news is just completely being absorbed by things related to current events.
Yeah.
I've decided
Rather than security news.
I'm not going to mention any of the magic words because I've seen people whose videos have barely been about current events and they get slapped with that, like, we want to tell you all about insert current major global catastrophe here. So, although I've already referred to like shelter in place and social distancing, so maybe I don't know how smart the YouTube stuff is, if it picks up on words in the description or the title, or it actually tries to catch your words in spoken stuff.
Cloudflare dropped reCAPTCHA due to privacy concerns.
Oh,
Cloudflare is moving away from Google reCAPTCHA and implementing HCAPTCHA, an independent capture provider that focuses on security and privacy. Interesting.
yeah. I mean, that kind of makes sense. I mean, Google reCAPTCHA captures, like, they fingerprint your browser, and one of the benefits of that is it's like you show up everywhere, but it's just another vector, I suppose, for Google to pin who you are to show you ads.
Well, I mean, that's their entire business model. So you
Yeah.
got to think that basically anything that Google does is trying to connect the dots back to you somehow for advertising to be more accurate. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, basically he's going through a bunch of the CEO talks about a bunch of things about how they've had issues in certain countries that block Google and other things, and how they've just swapped over to see how this one goes.
What else have we got? There's nothing interesting on Reddit.
Zoom will add a choose your own routing adventure to stay out of China. Um, in the
Yes.
latest Zoom security catch-up sprint meeting, they announced a new feature that will allow users to choose the data center region. Oh, so it's just choosing which data center region your call is going to be placed in, so that it's not
That's.
necessarily always China.
I mean, if their customer base has picked up and you're starting to get like bigger organizations, like in Australia, I mean, I think most of the people who watch this are from Australia, but occasionally there's people from other places. Um, we've got like fairly stringent data sovereignty requirements here.
Well, see, this is the thing. New South Wales Department of Education has explicitly said everyone must use Zoom and nothing else.
Yes, so this is the problem is we have pretty strict data sovereignty laws. They don't actually mean you can't put your data anywhere. It means you have to either put your data in a country that is compatible privacy laws, which the US is always a toss a coin on, because technically data of non-US citizens is like they don't care about. But
Yeah.
most of the time the US is considered fine. But yes, China is not on the you should put your data here list.
No, yeah. And when
Like,
I heard that, I put that down to a someone didn't do their research or someone just made a wrong decision
well,
when they were deciding what tool, and they won't stand down on it either, even with everything that's been going on. They haven't stood down and said, you know what, actually we better use something else.
either someone's reputation's on the line, or they just think it's going to be too hard to try and switch.
Yeah.
Which might be it. They might already have a bunch of integrations with Zoom, so like authentication and stuff like that.
It's
Anyway,
possible, yeah.
it's probably time to actually get this truck rolling. Let me go here. Yes, so that should come through in due time into YouTube. But I've just switched screens, so as mentioned, gosh, it was all of 5 minutes ago. Geez, it feels like an age ago now. That's how out of it I am. What a day. We're looking at a while back. We looked at some questions on the Security Stack Exchange or InfoSec Stack Exchange, and we figured because we haven't really had a ton of time to kind of plan stuff.
I mean, we've had the time, we just haven't done it.
We'll put it like this: we've been Benjamin Franklin
Otherwise, we've been
represent.
otherwise engaged.
Yeah, well, we had a long weekend. I'm sure it was Easter everywhere in the world, but we had a long weekend and we were just enjoying yesterday. So we didn't end up actually sitting down and prepping. So we
Well, I didn't
figured,
even realize that it was a 4-day weekend. I thought it was only Friday. So I was very ready to just like start work on Monday. And then I found out that it was a 4-day weekend and I didn't have to. So that
yeah,
was always a pleasant surprise.
gets you in the zone to prep for a stream. So we thought rather than not streaming at all, which was an option, we would still do something that we think actually provides some value. So like a while back we tried to do like a let's play Borderlands and talk about InfoSec. That didn't really work, so we're not
No, that
probably not
didn't.
going to do that again. But these ones, we feel like there's still some value to them. So I guess we should like just jump straight into the first one.
Sure,
Um,
let's do it.
and this is a more casual one as well, so feel free to get like a wine or a beer or a non-alcoholic beverage of your choice. I'm drinking some Pepsi Max tonight. Fine
I've got
cheese,
good old
crackers,
water
yeah, or water. Better get off that stuff, mate. I hear it's
on
deadly.
the hard stuff. Yeah.
Well, vodka's mostly water, so. Um, so I guess the first question we've got, this one's a bit hard to understand because of the English. I think it might be a Google Translate job, but this person's asking the question, I like the word firewall overtures request, that phrase. I want to use that now. Just have you perform the firewall overtures.
Have you performed the
It's like, you know, I have an overture is like a kind of song. It's just like
or
a bit of a.
add procedure? Have you
Let's
followed the firewall overture procedure?
let's be honest. Getting firewalls through is always a song and dance.
This
Um,
is true.
so he's currently requested in his enterprise to do himself. I'm guessing he's part of the security team. The firewall requests. So Twofin's like a firewall workflow tool. Instead of our local IT team, it's for simplicity and cost saving. So,
So basically, they're
yeah.
in-housing their firewall guy to
Well,
the internal security team
well,
rather
so
than
the
a service provider or something like that.
so the next bit actually though says the open firewall rules are opened by the network team of their IT provider with the control of the security team of the IT provider. So he's saying that people have to go to him and ask him to raise requests to the firewall service provider.
Yep.
And I'm
Okay.
guessing actually that might be to I've seen things like this, and that's so that they vet the requests going through. Because normally service providers will implement whatever you give them. They don't necessarily know your business that well, and so they'll just go, "Oh, yeah, you obviously have a legit reason for this."
Yeah,
Um,
you've told us you want it, so we'll do what
yeah.
you tell us.
So I'm assuming that's what he's saying, that he has to raise the requests for the vendor, and then
Yeah.
they go and do it rather than just IT.
And that's how I've seen it in even some big orgs where
Yeah.
internally they have a firewall guy and he's the one that asks the questions and does the vetting and all that kind of stuff. But in reality, when he goes, yes, you can have that firewall rule in place, he then just goes and contacts the service provider or the whoever actually controls the firewalls to say,
So I guess
yeah, I vetted this, go open it.
I guess what this guy's asking is there any point for me being in the loop, or should the IT people directly ask the service provider? I
Yeah.
guess this is difficult because there's two different thoughts to go down here. Is one unnecessary bureaucracy. So if you was the security person raising these requests, this person might not even be a firewall guy. They just might be someone in the security team, a BA, a team lead, a technical resource off managing a SIEM or
Like
something.
a
Someone,
SOC management
yeah,
or
or someone
like
in
a
the
SOC
SOC.
user or something. Yeah.
So they themselves may not have a ton of context on the networking rules, and so if someone goes, "I need this firewall rule," like, so most organizations tend to like layer how they do security. So a project wants to do something, make thing A talk to thing B. That project, as a going concern, might engage a resource from a central security team to help them identify, you need to onboard to the SIEM or the security event and incident management system. You need to onboard to the WAF. You need to do this. You need to do that. And that tends to be fairly if this, then that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Like, oh, it's a website. You need to be behind the WAF. What
Yeah.
data classification are you handling? Oh, very sensitive data. You need to go on the SIEM, or you need to like encrypt your data or whatever.
Yeah.
It's not the art of security. It's the process of security, which are two different things. And so what you end up with is someone who it becomes their job to be the random point of contact for getting firewall rules in, but they don't add any value. That's always
They're just the one with the permissions to do it.
yeah. They're the one who are allowed to raise the requests.
Yeah.
They could add value by going, "What's this flow for? What's your architecture look like?" But very quickly, you can get out of the realms of where, especially if it's a more junior resource, their level of understanding. And humans, we tend to go two ways when we don't understand a problem. We either completely shut down and go, "No, this isn't happening," or we go, "Sure, do whatever you want,"
We
because I
just
don't
blindly
understand what
trust.
you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I guess that's the bigger problem here is someone checking, and even better, what you want is a model that says, I don't know, like things in this insecurity, we have the concept of trust zones. So, these services face the internet. So they're like low trust. So we don't rely on them very much because we assume that people are trying to compromise them all the time. you put tons of controls on them, but they're still low trust.
Yeah.
Your database server that holds all your crown jewels, you want that to be somewhere high trust. So you want to be able to trust that the network's in good order, that the server's in good order. And normally these things are isolated off by firewalls. And effectively what you have is a bunch of, I don't know, policies or general rules or approaches that say this thing, so stuff in the low trust network, which is normally your web tier servers, can talk to, I don't know, some mid API tier in another network layer back.
A
And
sort
then
of
that can
mid
talk to
trust, yeah.
that can talk to your database. It's like a 3-tier app thing. I mean, that's simplistic because most apps don't actually have that architecture anymore, and there are like APIs that have databases right behind them, and then there are APIs with like 4 layers of databases. But you have API gateways and stuff in play, and the way authentication and all that sort of stuff works, and stuff change up the mix. But that's the general approach. So you simplify what are easy rules and difficult rules. And if someone's got a flow that you're like, oh, you're within the same network trust zone, we're not really going to worry too much about that communication happening versus, oh no, you're trying to connect a web server running a WordPress blog straight to, I don't know, like a core switch or payments environment or something dumb like that. And you go, no, if that's going to happen, that requires some like architecture and planning and development and whatnot to do properly. So you've got to kind of look at that thing. So a lot of it depends. Also, the other thing that comes to mind is the reason why you might have a process like this where some security guide, instead of general IT teams or projects directly raising requests with the service provider, the security guide might do it is for compliance, which says, so maybe they have to be compliant with something that says all firewall requests have to have been validated by an internal, like independent third party, like security. And so, it has to go through and then everyone goes, yep, the box has been ticked. The risk with compliance, like compliance isn't bad. It can define, here's the minimum baseline you need to meet to play a particular game, like in banking or whatever. The problem is not compliance, but the compliance mindset, which is, oh, we've ticked all the boxes. We have a dude that reviews all our firewall requests, and that dude isn't providing any actual control or protection. And so you're compliant but to the letter, but not the spirit. And that's the problem with compliance is compliance regimes are often written by the sort of people who are very bad at communicating. This is my opinion. We're in Reese's opinion zone. Compliance regimes are not often written by the sort of people who aren't great at selling the hearts and minds argument. And they don't have to. Normally, they've got the stick of the law or heavy financial penalties or whatever behind them that basically says, do what I do, rather than, hey, you should do this thing because it's good. And I mean, I've always advocated the reason why you should do the right thing as a company is because if you don't, you're going to get regulated, and getting regulated is always worse and more expensive than just doing the right thing.
Than just, ticking the boxes.
There are exceptions to that. Yeah. That's not always going to mean you always avoid compliance, but So that's kind of that one. I mean, we kind of jumped off from where I jumped off from where I thought he was coming from. It might be completely different given the English there, but that was what I inferred. Guess we'll jump to the next one, which
sounds good.
If you want to read this one out, if you can see.
All right. Can cell phone packets be read by someone who only has my phone number? So he got an IM from a person that they recently got acquainted with this year. In a text message, they asked if they knew the name of a website to download ebooks from. They found it really weird because they were just talking about it the same day, or they went on a website on their phone for the first time. There's only 2 weeks before the end of school. I'm trying to skip the bits that aren't really relevant.
I think
this person didn't provide with much information, so he's just wondering what are the odds that somebody contacted him using his phone number about a website that he recently visited for the first time.
So I think
he's worried that there's been some spyware installed on his phone, or that something on the website has maybe leaked some information, checked his phone's IMEI. IME? I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce that.
Well, so I think the general flow is he got a message from someone, and they'd said, "Hey, do you know this website called libgen.is?" Um, he and this guy who got messaged and who wrote this post goes, I literally went to that website today. How come he just messaged me about it today? Then he talks about how because he'd said, "Oh, my professors told me that I have to buy this book," and so he thinks it's a pretext or whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, and then he goes, "What are the odds that this is a coincidence?" He's had someone in the past um, install some. Sorry, he's had someone in the past who've gone onto his phone to get his IMEI. Got a new phone now, but with the same number, and he's broken ties with that person. Is it entirely possible someone could have access to my browsing history or geolocation just by them having my phone number? I mean, the easy answer in this one is like no.
Basically, no.
Yeah. So the
I guess it's almost like the title of the question is asking one thing, and then the body of the question is kind of asking something else, like purely through cell phone traffic, if you like. I haven't really seen. I mean, there are intercepting tools and things like that, like you've heard of stingrays and all of that stuff, which can intercept cell phone data, but that's not something that any normal security person probably has access to.
Well, also the data they can tend to read, they can figure out your location. I think they still have to triangulate, but they can. Well, but if you're connected to a particular stingray, they at least know you're close enough to connect to that stingray.
Yes.
I think they can get like text messages and calls and stuff that's not encrypted.
Yes,
Web
exactly.
traffic from a phone is still encrypted from the phone.
Yeah,
I don't know
it'll
what
still use all the standard web security controls. And I mean, if the website, I've never heard of this libgen, but if that uses HTTPS, then, it'll still be, everything will still be encrypted.
Well, you know that they're going to libgen,
Yeah.
at the very least. But I don't know really what the layer 2 looks like for cell phone traffic. But
No.
this is like, so person checking his IME. That sounds like he's had some trouble in the past with this thing. Well, they didn't actually say they did anything, just try to find his IME, which there are various reasons you want to find IMEs. It lets you, I think you can like do things like unlock phones. Certainly I had a Motorola Razr that you had to put the IME into an app on your computer to unlock the phone. So there's some funny
You could probably
business.
does SIM swapping use the IME as well?
No, not that I'm aware of. Phone cloning?
Unless,
I don't know. Anyway, I mean, there's reasons to look up the IME. You can be, if you're trying to get into someone's like cell phone provider account. Sometimes you need to provide the IME to be able to prove some level of what you know or something you have. But no, you can't do it with just a phone number. Not that level of interception anyway. Not for the layman. It's just a coincidence. But it is interesting. I mean, I suppose this kind of backs onto the level of understanding. Like, for some people, I think there's a level of fear that comes with technology, and it's easy from a like narrative in your own head viewpoint to start joining dots. I mean, just look at some of the conspiracy theories around 5G stuff and the Huawei tech and people burning down towers and stuff. I mean, let's be honest, there is a lot that said nation state that is associated with Huawei can do because they control Huawei, and Huawei's kit's going to be everywhere. Like, if those things aren't audited and you're making sure that they're not doing anything funny, and even then, you might not be able to figure out if they're doing anything funny because sometimes people can be that good. But the sort of things you're more worried about there are like, mass hijacking and redirecting of traffic or whatever, not targeted attacks, and certainly not spreading said thing behind current global crisis.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like, man, if you're sticking like technology boxes everywhere that you effectively controlled, why would you use them to spread what we've got now when you could just use them for so much more nefarious things? People's conspiracy theories aren't good
Because
enough.
yeah,
They're too lame.
this
Be more
was just the
imaginative.
trial run. Didn't you know that this was just the trial run and the worst is still to come?
Oh man, yeah. There's always something worse. Um,
Moving on.
moving on. Is it a security risk to host a CSGO server on my PC? So I think we might have answered a similar question to this. These are always on this like particular Stack Exchange. So he said he's got a good password on his router, and he has no unwanted ports open, and he's goes except for DDoS attacks. Is a setup risk in any way? Point of contention. Every time someone says DDoS attack, I'm like, whatever happened to just good old DOS attacks? Like, an attack doesn't have to be distributed to be a denial of service. I just need
Everyone
more bandwidth than you, or the ability to throw enough traffic at you to make your CPU melt through the floor. That's about it.
or your poor little router overload, yeah.
I attempted to run a Minecraft server with a fairly, because you gave it a whirl with
Yep.
a fairly hefty mod pack, and on a reasonably spec like laptop just running pretty straight up Linux, the thing heaved. It didn't run
It
properly.
only took four of us to really make it almost stop,
Yeah,
essentially.
and at no point,
Technically, it could be DDoS because we were all in different distributed
yes,
locations.
technically, but there's like volumetric attacks, and then what's the other one? Volumetric is just where you choke up the plumbing with so much traffic that packets stop working being sent. And then the other sort, which is just slipped my mind, but that's where you target specific parts of an application and that tend to use more cycles. So password calculation logic, which has to hash passwords. And if there's no rate limiting on it, you can make a server fall over just by hitting all the expensive bits, like CPU computationally expensive bits. Anyway, that aside, I would say it. I mean, a lot of this depends on a bunch of different factors. Like, if said server app has no real known vulnerabilities, you're probably okay. If someone's scanning the internet on whatever port, because normally when you mass scan the internet, you don't scan every single port on every single host because that takes forever.
No.
You
But
scan.
tools like Shodan and things like that, this could potentially show up on
Well, I think even
eventually.
Shodan to an extent only scans for like known ports and protocols. They might do some like low and slow scan everything, but most do 80, 22,
Yeah, it'll
pick,
depend on what port CSGO runs on.
or you might define that yourself. I don't know.
Yeah, it also depends on his config for his, if he's talking about his local gaming PC or something, a lot of gamers might turn their local firewall off because that gets in the way of their online games or things like that that might also open him up in
Or
ways that he's not quite expecting or hasn't mentioned in this post at least.
admittedly, I always turn off my local firewall. I got
There you
like
go.
I got a network firewall. Like,
To be fair, you probably know a lot more about what you're doing network wise than this guy does.
well, it's more I know the consequences and I'm prepared to own them if it happens. But
And that as well.
I don't I don't I don't really open my desktop up straight to the internet. I've
Yeah.
got other stuff open up to the internet though, but it's all I mean, I've got and you've just set yours up as well, but I've got Ubiquiti Kit and I've like segmented my network. So stuff that's available on the internet can't get to where like my desktop and file share and stuff is. So
Yeah.
um
Exactly. So
I,
I guess the other thing is, I mean, you can probably kind of read that in the top answer there, but things like 0-day vulnerabilities or anything that's
yeah.
unpatched for the actual CSGO server itself. So I don't know if we've done it in a stream, but certainly in some capture the flags I've worked on, they've used like an old Unreal Tournament server that's had a vulnerability or Crossfire, which was an old school Linux multiplayer game, things like that, as ways of gaining access to the CTF box. So it's definitely possible that the CSGO server has vulnerabilities.
They raise a good point as well in that first comment. Run the get process, and this goes for any server, not just game servers. Run the process with the minimum amount of permissions required. So again, that Minecraft
Exactly.
server I was running, I ran that as a local user, not as root.
Yeah, rather than run it as the admin or your current user, create a specific user with lower permissions to
Yeah.
run it. If he's talking about a Windows host, you can do the run as, the right click run as thing. If he's on Linux, there's plenty of other ways of changing or setting which user runs the process. So
Well, and
that's another thing, yeah.
and depending on the use case as well, the other option is like VPN services. Like what are some of the game specific VPN things that we used to use for stuff?
It was like Hamachi or something like
Hamachi, yeah.
that.
I mean, you could try and roll your own. Otherwise, there's specific services that'll
Like you could set your own open VPN up locally or something like that as well.
yeah.
But yeah, basically, instead of making it public to the internet, make it on a VPN or something like that, so that it's not so exposed, and just give access to trusted friends you're playing with or whatever.
Next one. This one was a fun one because we did read through these before we jumped on.
Yeah.
This one has a little bit of like a bit extra to it, but does signing of so you can sign HTTP requests.
And it's all the rage nowadays, apparently.
Yeah. The benefits of doing so when communicating over an insecure channel are clear. With signatures, you can bring message integrity and authentication to such an environment, but I'm struggling what signatures bring to the table when the communication channel is secure, like TLS. Message integrity is guaranteed by TLS, and authentication could be a much simpler shared secret like an API key. The only thing I can come up with is niche scenarios in which sharing secrets is not desirable, or exchanging the secret needs to happen on an insecure channel. Perhaps it is a security in depth which merits it. So my first thought is at a high level and in kind of, I suppose, if you think of average scenarios, like average low risk, like low risk sort of scenarios where, you might have two APIs exchanging some like low level data inside a company. He's kind of right. Like, if you're using TLS, your level of kind of securities lifted up to a point where, at least at the transport layer, so the pipe, the pipe between 2 points is valid, so is authenticated to an extent and can't be modified. Stuff going through it can't be modified unless it's been intercepted. The challenge is, in our modern world with TLS interception absolutely everywhere, and API gateways and reverse proxies and forward proxies and a whole host of everything else. I mean, imagine you're on a phone. Actually, we'll get to this with one of the later questions we'll run through. But imagine you're on a corporate network with your personal phone, but to get on the network, you had to install a management app and some certificates. And then inside that, you had an app that's talking to your bank. If you want your bank to be able to validate that you've sent them stuff properly end to end, I mean, I suppose actually HTTP signing probably isn't end to end, given what we found out before about how HMACs work. That it's the two sides of the HTTPS connection generate a shared secret that's used for the HMAC. But in theory, if you're going to go full end to end, like sign the request at the source client and validate it in the destination, you don't need to trust any of the intermediate infrastructure anymore. But with HMACs aren't the same as like digital signatures. So
yeah, it also doesn't necessarily go into, I guess, sort of the authenticity of the message as well. So if you're if you're only trying to get a certain level of trust, like going back to the trust models, if you're expecting messages to only come from a certain place and you want to make sure that the messages do come from just that one place, then something like signing is perfect for that. But if it's a a web API or something like that that could come from any sort of anywhere, any client,
Yeah.
then it's going to be a lot of overhead to create and manage those shared secrets for all of your
Well,
connected clients.
I think they're inherent in the protocol, but there is probably an overhead with them at a low level. I think once you switch it on, it just happens. But I also
There'd
would
be extra
say
overhead somewhere, yeah.
I would also say mutual authentication, so MATLS or MASSL, depending on which one you've heard, also works as well because the client authenticates the server and the server authenticates the client,
Yes.
um, which is also good for restricting where traffic can come from as an option. The reality is that we have a whole toolbox of ways of ensuring the integrity of communication, that you've got tons of options, and this is one of them.
Yeah. And I guess strictly in terms of, does signing have any benefit if you're already using TLS? Again, that sort of will really
Yeah,
depend on the application itself rather
yeah,
than
and your
necessarily, yeah.
threat model. Like, so if you're so in a so from what I've seen with how HMACs are generated in these protocols, you have your normal public-private handshake deal going on.
Yep.
Um, well, actually, with TLS, because you've got your server handshake and then some server. You grab the I think the client grabs the server's public key, then sends along some data back that the client will use as its key, and then they will figure out a shared secret key for the actual. So TLS isn't public private when it's actually running. That's only for the handshake. Once it's running, there's a session key that's generated. And I have a feeling the HMAC is either the session key or derived from the session key, or built alongside the session key. And so
Yep.
the idea is if the tunnel's compromised later by someone who's managed to man in the middle at some low level, I guess. But the reality is when you do TLS interception, you can also control everything else about the communication. So you could like grab the incoming on one end, strip off the HMAC, put your own HMAC on it,
Exactly. Yep.
modify it, put your own, like, you know. I guess this ends up in one of these weird situations where, like, I guess maybe at some point it's feasible to do stuff at some, like, really weird low level, but I don't know.
It's one of
Um,
those, yeah, like maybe in some apps for some purposes it would be
yeah. I,
beneficial, but it
I
doesn't
had a,
necessarily.
I had assumed HTTP signing was, like, properly end to end, but yeah, my reading up, it's not. It's every point along the trip would separately have different HMAC validations. So if you're going through proxies and stuff, those
Yeah, they would
those
all have to
yeah.
do it
So because you're well, it'd be between the proxy and the
per
server if the server
per
requires it
hop.
or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. As far as I can tell, this is probably one of the areas where put a little asterisk up and say do your own research and consult your own experts because I'll be honest, I didn't even know signing a HTTP request was a thing. I've thought, well, I guess you could sign like JSON and application data and stuff, and I've seen solutions that have done that. But at the protocol level, I didn't realize it was an option. So I've always just used TLS and Mazel when you really want to make sure both ends can have to validate each other before they start talking. So
Yeah.
um, this is another interesting one. Um, So the initial question, without reading the rest of this, can name and date of birth be hashed somehow to generate a secure identifier? Just want to let you for a moment bask in that and think about it.
Yeah. So just think about hashing versus encryption
And also the source data used for hashing to
and the
be
source data used.
and the
Yeah.
word secure identifier. Um Without looking at the rest of this yet. And where you'll come to is probably similar where I didn't be like, that doesn't pass my sniff test. Yeah, that's the sort of thing you'd be like, really? Like, how hard is it to generate a random GUID? Like, or whatever for an identifier. However, I won't actually read this word for word, but um, what he's saying is this guy is involved in building an application and securing an application that is used in third world countries where people don't have regular access to the internet. So your
Yeah.
normal approach would be, so by secure identifier we mean credential in the context of this. So it's something you log in with,
Yeah.
not
Like a
not like a
username or an email address
yeah,
or something like
not
that.
a primary key in the users table,
No.
or the use And so this is meant to be an all-in-one kind of
It's a something that you can use to identify a user, but something that they can also use to identify themselves
yeah.
with, and he's got bolded there without any extra effort to remember.
And so their use cases, people might have access to the internet a couple of times a year. This might be for banking. This might be for tax. This might be for censuses. Who knows what? Like it maybe as a government thing. I at a previous employer, they had bought a company in another country that was located near a whole bunch of developing nations, and and they had this sort of problem where they're like people don't even have like national IDs, let alone necessarily remember their date of birth or know their own date of birth. So when you're
Yeah.
dealing with these countries, you realize you have to really roll back expectations and go, what's more important? People's privacy when it comes to their names and dates of births. Given that in these countries as well, the risk associated with those is a lot less than it is in the West, where
Well,
with
that's it. Yeah.
enough
Like,
personal information, I can go and get a home loan in someone else's name. Here, it's probably not a massive risk, but yeah, like what's more important, that they get access to these services when they can, or that information's protected. And so he just goes and talks about how they would look to hash and salt the full name and date of birth together. The user would then enter that in the login screen. Um, they also talk about then trying to use a picture for facial recognition and comparison. So, as far as I can tell, they would use the key, so the hashed name and date of birth and salt. How they're getting the salt is the question, though, because normally you'd look up the username field, grab the salt,
yeah.
then go and hash the password they've given you. In this case,
It
you'd
almost
need
sounds like he's talking about a single hard-coded
in
salt or
this game
something.
you'd need to look up. Yeah, it's either a single hard coded salt, or you'd need to look up the person's name and date of birth, which aren't hashed. So yes, it's probably a static salt. You are probably correct. Um, and then use that as a key to decrypt a picture, and then there would be some facial recognition, so that they would. I mean, I suppose that necessitates, would this person have access to something with a camera on it to do real time facial recognition?
Well,
But
this is
that,
where, yeah, like it sort of says you're doing a comparison of two pictures, but that depends on, I guess,
well,
how you're going to hash the pictures because, I
well,
mean, if the background changes or anything
no,
about the picture,
it's they're not hashing the picture. They're doing. I think he's talking about
AES
facial
picture data,
recognition. So
because he's
using.
got,
So
yeah,
this is the key. That's the hash of that, and then the scrambled date of birth and the name together, without the hash, is the encryption key. Right? Okay, that's good. So that means you can't just use the hash to decrypt the pictures,
yeah.
but they're actually the challenge here is facial recognition. So to an extent,
Oh, yeah, okay, it does say it's happening.
like facial recognition using regular cameras is probably good enough in this context. But there's a reason why Apple, in their kind of phone-based facial recognition, or sorry, mobile facial recognition, have all the extra cameras uh, to really get all the other kind of data you need
It's
about
to
the
get
face.
depth and
Yeah,
the extra detail, yeah.
yeah, so that you can get the vectors, because it's all just comes down to a set of vectors, and then that's what goes and sorts your stuff out. So here, I mean, again, it depends on the risk model, but got to factor that in as well. But given the scenario, I found this an interesting one, because I've had this before in projects where you realize that because of the nature of your user base, you have to build a compromised solution. And
Yep.
especially when it's legislated that you have to do it like this. So I was at a place and they were going to roll out user accounts for everyone so that they could access SharePoint and stuff. And I was like, right, MFA. We're going to do proper MFA. And they're like, oh, we can do SMS, and maybe even then the unions might not let us do SMS without us having to buy everyone a phone. And
Yep.
so
I've had that argument
luckily that one
before.
happened because the sell to the union was where securing their data, and they bought it. But getting next gen MFA wasn't going to happen, because they were that at that point they were like, not everyone has a smartphone, so you're going to buy everyone a smartphone. And then there's also technical capability. Setting that stuff up requires a level of, it doesn't require tons of technical ability, but it requires a level of confidence with technology to be able to set up and, not get confused about. So, it was just an interesting one. And I guess two more, last two, and then we'll call it.
Okay.
What is the difference between secure code review and secure static code analysis? What would you say, Jack?
I would say that a code review is a manual process of actually looking through the code, and static code analysis is generally done by sort of automated tools and things like that.
Yeah, static analysis tends to
It's
be like you either build like a call graph of the
yeah,
application based on source code, or you
it's
trans
running some sort of tool over the source
yeah
code looking for specific patterns
yeah and
that
and gen
exist rather than what the code actually does.
well, and you get tools like check marks, which their model effectively boils down to build the call graph, see where user input comes from, and then does the user input at some point go through a sanitization function.
Yeah.
Or something's going out to logs, other logs going through a sanitization function. Um, Other tools might just search for specific function names and go, oh, that function's a vulnerable function, or, that function can have security issues in it. You got IAST and stuff, which is actually runtime analysis,
Yeah.
um, to
That's
see.
like the DAST and stuff as well.
Yeah, well, DAST is then preventative. IAST is like monitoring, and then you run a
Yeah.
standard test suite, and it'll tell you what it thinks it doesn't like, and then DAST will actually prune off risky code paths if it thinks it's seen one. I say
Yeah.
prune off risky code paths. I'm sure that's not how it works, but that's just where my brain is at the moment. But yes, whereas a secure code review is someone sitting down, and I've used a bunch of different techniques when I've had to do them. You might do a bit of greppage to find things that might be suspicious. Search for variables called password. Search for, one of my favorite ones is use AD domains, because you'll generally find the domain / username format.
Yep.
You might actually just sit there and look through code or find specific chunks. You go, this bit does the auth, I'll look at this.
Looking at like auth functions to see if there's any obvious logic flaws or comparisons to hard-coded secrets or things like that that might be
Yeah.
obvious or easy for someone to bypass if they had the right knowledge.
Stuff that static code analysis spots as well. And the reality is, static code analysis is, it can be very noisy, but it'll also spot most of the stuff a human being will spot. At least the first order problems. Neither of them will probably spot, oh, you've got a high end weirdo crazy buffer overflow here. Some static analysis tools might just tell you you're using the wrong function, or warn you that, hey, if you haven't done your maths properly here when you're assigning space or allocating a buffer, you'll be in trouble. But other than
Yeah.
that, they don't necessarily find the weird high order things. But they get the job
Same with
done.
certain logic things as well. Like they might
Yeah.
just look at if the code is sort of in the right format or whatever, but it might not realize that, if one of your variables is somehow set to false, you end up in this completely different function or line of code that could potentially be a security risk or somewhere that's
And this
outside
is why,
of the current user context and stuff like that.
well, oh, sorry, my bad. I was getting DAST. I was thinking of RAST or RASP with real-time application security protection.
Yeah.
DAST is basically where you run a tool like Burp or
Yeah, while it's
ending a
running.
web inspector or whatever,
Yeah,
over
over the
over a running app.
compilers.
And the
Yeah.
problem with all of these things is they don't have business logic in mind. They're basically looking
No,
for
exactly.
flaws in programming. So
Yeah, they're looking for the flaws in the code itself rather than the
yeah,
flaws in the business
and
logic or app logic.
and so that's where a secure code review can work. If your secure code review isn't focused so much on you've just sent a query to MySQL and you didn't sanitize the input, but your
Yeah,
security code review is more focused on does the authentication logic stack up so that you can't have what PayPal had happen on their mobile app where you can bypass MFA.
yeah.
Um,
Or, you have a function that's if is admin is true, then, do all this admin stuff. And
yeah,
somewhere earlier on the line, the user can actually control that is admin Boolean somehow, giving them access to features of the app that they shouldn't have permissions to. That's
yeah.
the sort of stuff that static can't necessarily know because it doesn't really look at, I guess, business logic and user context type issues.
Yeah. And I guess last one for the night
Okay.
before we call it and then disappear and actually do a proper job of prepping for next week. EduRoam decrypt SSL traffic. So EduRoam, I think I've seen them in Australia as well. They're an organization that will run Wi-Fi networks in places and they're free.
Yeah.
Um,
They're free for like students and things like that. Well,
yeah,
EduRoam specifically is, yeah, I think it's so that like EduRoam is in every public school so that it doesn't matter what school you go to, you can use your EduRoam account to sort of access the internet without being necessarily associated with that school. Similar to universities, like if you go to the University of Melbourne, you could also come up to the University of Brisbane and access the internet and resources and things like that using EduRoam.
just gonna have a look to see if it has the because so what's happened is normally for like authing to networks. So I had to do this with my current client with my company laptop is install a certificate when I installed their Cisco thing to be able to join the network. And most of the time, and you can see it like the certificate, like EAP TTLS PAP. It's a client certificate
Yeah.
because the EAP bit.
And so
So
this is what he's sort of worried about is
yeah,
if he trusts this random certificate that it's saying he has to trust, will it be able to decrypt his SSL traffic, assuming through like a proxy or something like that, rather
yeah.
than is it just a Wi-Fi auth certificate or something?
And I suppose you might mention it down there. I mean, I haven't. Depends on the like mobile operating system you're using, but or even like on Windows and stuff. Certificates can end up in particular locations, and so I definitely think. So, for example, in Firefox, you can specify if a if a certificate is usable for authenticating servers, which
Yeah.
means trusted for web traffic or not. And you can just
Or if it's an
yeah.
identifying certificate rather
But
than a, yeah.
this also isn't a full cert chain with all the although
I
CA
think he
true.
said that he's changed a bunch of stuff for, well, he says security, but
Oh,
more for
he's
privacy.
changed all the numbers. That's
Yeah.
fine. But the I'm trying to remember if this basic constraints means CA true means it can't be a CA cert, if it can be. But you have things like the constraints. It doesn't mention it here as well, but I think you can force certs to be client or server, and if nothing's specified, CNCA research. Okay, skull.hr. Um, then that might actually be because the common name CA roots. Oh no, wait a second. So I always get confused with the way you read these things. So issuer that's the issuer information, and
Yeah.
that's the subject information. Um, but the common name is the same.
It's the
So
same. Yeah.
maybe it's self signed. Either way, you could, depending on the cert store it ends up in. Plus, the other way to check is you just simply look at the SSL cert valid information when you go to any of your website, and if it says anything about this certificate when it should be saying something
Yeah,
about Google or
skull.hr or whatever.
Microsoft, or normally like some things get whitelisted, so you pick something obscure or something that's always going to be intercepted because they're worried you're leaking data, like Reddit, for example, and see if you're intercepted there. And if you're not, there's a good chance that there's no interception going on.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah.
similar to if you've ever used Burp and then you try and go to Google or something like that. If you don't tell Firefox to trust the Burp certificate, it won't let you access any of the sites because if it actually uses the Burp certificate, not the Google cert, to try and do all of the proxy interception stuff.
Yeah.
And once you trust the certificate and you go to google.com, like you said, if you click the little green lock, it won't say that you're running through a Google cert. It'll say you're running through the Burp cert that you've manually trusted.
So the first answer, okay, he said that's not an official edu-roam certificate. This could be something that the university. I mean, at our university, when we had to do self certs to get on the Wi-Fi, didn't we? I'm pretty sure.
I think we did.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. It was like 10 years ago.
Mm.
I remember having to do something anyway. We had to do stuff with like EAP. So, but
I think we did
yes,
have to trust an EAP certificate for the Wi-Fi.
yes.
I don't know if it was for. I
Well,
mean, it
because
probably did
I
proxy
think in
stuff as well.
client auth for Wi-Fi, you also have to validate the certificate coming back from the network, which is where the trust thing tends to come in, and you just go
Yeah, because I've
trust.
had that issues with
Well, because
my
they're
setting up
all
my Ubiquity stuff with the Radius auth.
yeah.
Windows pops up and says, "This is the signature for the certificate you're about to connect with, or to, sorry. Are you sure this is the same one as the one you're expecting?" sort of thing.
I guess though, depending on the context, so they've got this certificate there. If it's just only allowed for Wi-Fi authentication, which I'm pretty sure you can do on Android, you can restrict the context the cert can be used in. That's not a big issue as long as it can't be used as CAs. It's a bit concerning that the thing looks like it can be used as a CA certificate, which then can be used for, especially because this is just a public cert. I don't think he's got anything about the private key here.
Yeah.
SHA-1 with RSA encryption. That's the signature. RSA public key modulars. So this looks like it could be a public cert. It could be an interception cert that he set up as a part of the setup process. The other thing too is when you tend to not be on the Wi-Fi with the interception, like, unless they've done some magic to force you to always be on a VPN, or they've auto-configured like proxy information on your device to always force you to go to some box they control to route your traffic. Once you're off their network, they're not going to see anything. That said, it's always a good idea to go through and just look at all of the certs that are trusted by Windows default. And there's always a few key ones I like to remove. Really just comes down to be aware what you're doing when you trust certificates. It's basically
Yeah.
it. And that's probably
So
everything.
that basic constraint extension is used to mark certificates. The mark that a certificate belongs to a CA, giving them the ability to sign other CAs. So a
Okay.
non-CA certificate will have the CA set to false or omitted. So the CA true basically means that it is a CA that has the ability to sign other certificates.
Which then indicates this is probably this is potentially an intercepting cert. Also, RSA 2010-24-bit and SHA-1 as the signature algorithm. So have when it was issued.
Yeah, it was
Not
2011.
before 2011. Oh,
Yeah.
that's definitely no. I that's definitely a that's 10 years. That's a CA cert. That's what they tend to do. They just issue them for 10 years. So, well, a shade under 10 years is like a few days. But yeah, anyway, that's that. Next week we'll hopefully be back with something more our usual flavor. Understand this one was just a lot of talking, but for the 3 people who managed to hang in there, cheers. We appreciate it.
Yeah, we do.
Have a good one and stay safe with everything that's going on.
Exactly. See ya.